Caliban was a rather pleasant divergence. At first, thinking his daughter had yet to arrive, he had decided upon a similar solution to Baal. Purgation of the dangers of the world, establishment of an imperial colony, integration of the locals, and moving on. Baal was abrim with mutation and creatures of chaos, a wild and wasteland-riddled world. Its conquest had to be done with a great army and dedicated slaughter. The least warp-spasmed lives were spared and left to become the laborers of the imperial city to be established there. Caliban was different. Thick and overflowing with life, flora and fauna both, with a notable lack of mutation amongst its inhabitants despite proximity to the Great Storm to the galactic southwest. The beasts of Caliban told him what he needed to know. A half-functional psi device of some manner hidden deep within the planet, still working to draw winds of change from the warp and condense them for some purpose. Whatever its original design, now it served to create the beasts of Caliban. Grand and unique creatures of predation, filled with the mutagenic magics of the nearby warp, and filled with terrible malignancy. Most importantly, the beasts of Caliban took on the bulk of the twisting energies that flowed into the planet, leaving the rest of the population mostly untouched. Reservoir creatures that took on chaotic immaterium and converted it into creatures from humanity's collective fears. But they were creatures, not daemons. They acted as creatures do. Predator beasts with meat and hides and bones, all useful things when harvested from their corpse piles. He had made sure to sample many and found their natures had changed in the process from chaos to mere meat. Roasted and honey-glazed and delicious meats. It was delightful to realize. He had to go back to that place in time to study that device and understand its functions. He had half a mind to install a copy of it upon every world in the Imperium, assuming, of course, that it had no malign long-term effects. Indeed, he had thought that his daughter had not yet landed. Engaged in battle with two great white lions, one snuck around behind him. He had foreseen this and was planning on a clever maneuver. In his youth, he remembered slaying a great lion, a quest given to him to atone for a fit of terrible wrath. He did not recall the reason for his anger, or the face of the one who tasked him with it. A king, perhaps, or maybe a shepherd, or just a boy. It did not matter. The lion had a golden hide, which was unbreachable by mortal weapon, and looked quite handsome about his shoulders. Its hide was impervious. The flesh inside was not. He forced an arm down its throat and crushed the heart in his fist, he thinks. Or maybe he strangled it. It was slain regardless, and the quest had been completed without hindrance. He'd been planning on something similar with the lion behind him, claw gauntlet readied. At that time the sky cracked, the warp convulsed, and the life container that shielded his daughter from the warp smashed through the air and crashed into the lion's skull. Quickly slaying the other beast, he approached the container to find one thrashing in a manner only infants could, a mighty frown on her face. The corpse of the lion serving as her landing cushion. Oh, how he howled with laughter at that, taking up his daughter, emptying his satchel of trophies, and carefully swaddling her inside. Her sisters were quite surprised to see him remove her from the satchel at the end of the first day. His daughter, not a day old and already making him proud. Most pelts of his kills he gave to Caliban, to do with as they willed. The pelts of the two lions he made sure to keep, once for himself and one for his daughter, for little Atalanta. She'd need a fine cloak when she was finished growing. What better than her first slain beast? Seated once more on the golden throne, he focused. The bulk of his will was dedicated to maintaining the great projection of his soul, shearing away through the twisting narratives of the immaterium. A small portion of his will was dedicated to manifesting gentle images in the air before him, weapons of various designs. Resting in the crook of his arm, Atalanta stared transfixed, quiet for a child, and enraptured in the most fundamental method of learning humanity had. Mimicry. Not of the body or mind, however. The golden image of a sword gently hovered in the air before him, and slowly he made it act as if it was wielded. Block, parry, swing, thrust, all the motions inherent to a sword. All the narratives a sword engages in. A materium hollow image brought into being by a small application of will. A useful learning trick he had picked up some time ago. Slowly, crudely, Atalanta's soul changed shape. Its gentle swirls of light and color condensed slightly into something closer in shape to a set of crossed lines. It kept trying to lengthen, sharpen, but her control was not yet fine enough for that. Smiling, he slowly returned the images to a ball of gentle light and waited for her soul to do the same. A shapeless thing at one glance, a complex thing at another glance. A mass of bright and sharpened silver, folding with layers and potential, but in truth was merely one thing. Formless steel, yet unworked by the fire of her will. Then he shaped the gold projection into a spear and began the process anew. As children ought to do, she attempted to copy what she saw, and her soul did its best to lengthen, to sharpen, to thrust. It was perhaps the poorest spear he had ever seen. It was an excellent start. It was important to teach her many forms early, lest her spirit ossify into a single shape. Lusum had been his initial attempt, an experiment in some part to see if what he desired was even possible. A warrior that could aid him against the horrors of Terra, if not an equal, then a powerful son by his side. He had succeeded, but his initial process had been flawed, limited. The boy was powerful, the boy was loyal, the boy was not a warrior. He was a weapon. His spirit was mere fuel and memory, his metal flesh mere material to bring forth weaponry. His will was singular. He did not need powerful weapons. He needed powerful allies. But the boy's creation taught him much about the process, and with newfound wisdom he set to creating a second iteration. A batch of 20. But one does not start with 20 without first ensuring the process was understood. Malcador ensured he kept this in mind. Geneseed was forged, then put to work on creating less costly prototypes. The primordial strands were wrought from base human stock, and few survived more than a century. Once he had finally mastered the process, he moved back to the initial goal. He had set to work, and soon enough, embryonic Atalanta had been sired. The first complete success. Lusum had not reacted strongly upon seeing her initial state, but the fixed gaze told him the boy was intrigued by the prospect of having a sister. Atalanta was drawn from the aspect of his life he thought would serve her best. She was drawn from his many blended memories of slaying great and terrible beasts. The times in which the sword in his hands was the most valuable treasure he possessed, and his mind raced with visions of how he might overcome the foe before him. She would be far better equipped than he. His soul was a sword, after all. As much as he favored a sword, it was not always desired. It took great amounts of focus for it to be anything else, something that he found troublesome many times before. Some beasts simply were not suited towards being slain with swords. Some required axes or spears, or, smiling, he watched as she attempted to crudely mimic the bow and arrow he let dance before her infant eyes. Her soul slowly morphing and twisting in the attempt to form the complex shape. Even bows. She would be far better equipped than he, for her soul was any weapon she could imagine, and her mind would race with visions of how to best use all things at her disposal in order to achieve victory. She was a warrior, not a weapon, and she would serve him exceptionally well. She had proved that what he wished was possible, and with her success he moved on to drafting her many sisters. Sisters such as 10, which he could distantly feel on the world just beyond the reach of his sword. He smiled. This trip was quite productive thus far. Once, when she was a young woman, barely more than a child, with slothful eyes and pallid scales, a patriarch took her to the balcony of a grand city on the surface world. She had never been to the surface of any world before then. She had yet to return to one. Her forebears ensured she knew of their depravity and indulgences. Barbaric and crude, genolines intermingling carelessly, great violence in open streets and dunes, and visible to all. Yet the patriarch of the ancient and noble Navigator House of Strix had brought her to the surface, and none attempted to discourage him. Tradition, they called it, something that sat sour in his mouth as she felt the whipping winds dry her skin and the dust accumulate in her eyes. He made her wait there, and a grand procession began through the city. Armies of soldiers in thick-clad armor and wielding great crude weapons marching down a massive causeway, war machines and ramshackle jet bikes following. She had complained loudly and incessantly. The patriarch ignored her impudent requests to return to the comfort of their voidship homes. Instead, he commanded her to stand next to him, pointed a webbed and clawed hand at the final war machine in the distance, from which a light could be seen even through the glare of the horrid sun. In the rasp of a venerable elder he spoke, "Daughter of Strix, still your tongue, open your eye." and looked to the horizon. With impertinence in her heart, she did as she was bade. The eye upon her brow, concealed from the common rabble with silks and golds, focused. Fledgling and childish, her eye was still covered in the fog of youth. The vision was burned into her mind. She could not recall in precise detail what she bore witness to on that day. Golden and bright and burning, a presence and idea carved into her mind and vision. A man, and nothing more was certain until the patriarch spoke again. Distant and withered, pallid compared to that all-encompassing heat. This is heaven. Do not invoke its judgment. It took her months to recover from that terrible and awesome sight. Her eye burned to look upon a much duller world, strained with images of light and thunder. Slowly, she managed to muster herself to see once more, and with the return of her sight came clarity she had never known before. The twistings of the warp were suddenly quaint to behold, their writhing no longer so horrid and sickening, the false whispers no longer so easy to listen to. Her eye had been open before, but clouded. Her eye was clear now, and the hearts of men were plain to her sight. She grew from the experience. Soon she became a young woman, and her sight grew more and more efficacious. It was not the greatest among her peers, but it was more than respectable. Then came to her noble house a message from the Paternova himself. The command. The Emperor of Mankind required a navigator for his flagship, the behemoth Bucephalus, 170 kilometers in length and crown jewel of Sol's shipyards. She had been chosen for the honor. She was confused. Many among her generation were more talented than she. Many could see further or clearer. Many were more refined or intellectually gifted. Why her? She had been told in short and uncharacteristically blunt order. She had been chosen for her beauty, and little more. Her sight was clear enough to serve well, but she had been selected as an enticing doll. High cheekbones, full lips, pearlescent scales, dainty frame. A thing to be pleasing to look upon, and perhaps used, if the Emperor of Mankind was even capable of indulging himself in mortal flesh as hers. If the logistics of such a union were even possible. She was not opposed to this role. It was her duty to serve her house, and this was perhaps one of the greatest honors that could be bestowed. Lady Navigator of the Lord Emperor's personal vessel, her, given to her for the fortune of her breeding. The knowledge filled her with turbulent emotion. Surely the Lord Emperor, immortal conqueror, great unifier of Terra, slayer of God, monsters, bane of sorcerers, destroyer of mutation, banisher of Xenos, master of gene forging, and lord of the golden host, deserved more than an appealing idol to gaze upon. But it was not her place to argue against the Paternova, so she did as she was bid, and desperately attempted to improve the clarity of her sight. To be worthy of the throne she was thrust upon. All resources were available to her in this endeavor, for her position afforded her great authority to requisition assets in the pursuit of improvement. It never felt as if it were enough to truly be useful. Even as her sight expanded day after day, she held the private suspicion in her heart of hearts that the Emperor could see further than her still, that he did not need her in any regard. It was difficult to merely see beyond the reach of gold, beyond the tip of his embodied will. Even as her gaze strained for paths between, even the once shadowy warp was illuminated by the light of the Astronomicon and his present blade, even as she saw further and clearer each passing day. The path always felt warm. It was only enough to arouse her suspicions, and nothing more. Reality cracked. An eye ripped away into the materium. A fleet of thousands slowly emerged from this tier, sheltered by the now fading vision of gold left in their wake. She wet her lips, and slowly closing her eye, she spoke aloud in the most refined Terran she could muster. "Lord Emperor, we have arrived at Medusa. Delicate, sweet, refined, elegant." That was what the voice of a lady should be. Yet her tongue felt heavy, and her collar felt hot as she spoke. Medusa, another world bearing another of his children, their locations scouted by agents in his service. She felt her soul stain just looking upon it, choked in smog and thick with pollutants. She risked a furtive glance up and behind her at the face the Patriarch bid her to memorize. Some days were clearer than others. Some days it was almost impossible to look upon. Young and old, furious and joyous, handsome and hideous. The features were impossible to know with any certainty, everything possible at once and nothing true. Other days were clear, and on the clearest of those days she could almost see his face. Strong-jawed, high-cheeked, bronze skin, straight midnight hair. His eyes were always impossible to distinguish, hidden behind the ever-present sunfire that served as his sight, his crown, and his halo. This was a very clear day. She could see a gentle, fatherly smile on his face. She quickly pulled her gaze from it, feeling as if she was shaming it with her vision, and her eyes settled upon the babe in the crook of his arm. One of his daughters, the youngest yet recovered, golden-haired and emerald-eyed, fair-skinned and pudgy in cheek. It was an exceptionally beautiful baby. He rose, and her gaze was locked upon the moment. She desperately struggled to not picture the body beneath his armor, brazen and broad-shouldered, smooth of skin and firm of muscle. She failed. Her face was unbearably hot. "My gratitude, Lady Navigator, ... buts." The voice boomed. It rolled like thunder and flowed like honey. It sounded like a war horn and a lover's lyre. It filled the room with its utterances and settled into her memory without motion. His smile was upon her, and for one moment heat had flushed out all other sensations. His gaze turned, and the moment was over. A distant part of her wished that moment had lasted eternity. "Deputy Commander Harren, you have my license. Carry out my vision. Pews." The voice boomed again. The man in question snapped into a salute, prodigious will alone preventing him from falling to his knees. She was jealous of his self-control. "Custodian Sanctus, I entrust to you Atalanta Dopplas." The demigod, clad in gold, snapped into a salute and adjusted his posture, accepting the daughter of the Emperor into his arms with superhuman care and delicacy, immediately beginning to rock her in a rhythmic manner, bringing her eyes to rest. There was no need to command him to guard her with his life. That was already known to all parties bearing witness. Finally, the Emperor turned and began to walk down the immense steps of his immense throne. His newly acquired cloak, made from the skin of some truly immense and terrible white lion, waved as he descended. "Lord Archmagos, please relay my use of the Imperial Teleportation Array and ready an expedition army. This world may contain relics of interest, but Watts, the red-roped and barely human priest, began to fulfill these orders at once, not pausing in carrying out his commanded duties. Pausing to reply would be moot regardless, for in a crack of archaeotech lightning, the Emperor vanished from the helm of his ship, commanding the grand machine that connected distant points with naught but will. How he was able to do so was unknown to her. He simply was. The helm felt colder with his absence. Sitting in silence as the others went about their duties, she chanced another furtive glance, this time at the golden custodian, gently holding the infant daughter of the Emperor. Shamefully, she felt a great jealousy well up inside of her. Persephone the Eighth, daughter of the most ancient and noble house of Sturks and Lady Navigator of the Bucephalus, flagship of the Lord Emperor of mankind, found that she very much desired to hold the child and gently rock her in her arms. Her half-finished, almost knife chipped. Pausing in her work for a moment, she raised it up to inspect closer with a blank expression on her face. This salvage was overly high in carbon then, for the metal to be this brittle. She frowned and tossed the hunk of metal into the second pile. She would need to put it through an oxygenation process to make it useful to her, and it would be more effective to simply find a different section of the ruins to acquire metal from. She would leave this pile here and come back to it another time if she ever somehow ran low on metal. It was doubtful. There were mountains of material still left to dig through, and at her current rate she would finish her duty long before she had to resort to such low-quality material. There was no sense in attempting to destroy it, though. She'd leave it in storage just in case. That was all the metal sorted through. Standing up from the floor of the natural cave, she walked over to the immense chain, hooped through a ring impaled on the floor, attached to a wheel above, which was in turn attached numerous cogs, which were in turn attached to a crude air-blowing fan. Turning the wheel via a lever, she slowly wound up the immense chain until the weight it was attached to was far into the air, adjacent to the ceiling. Finally raised to its highest point and wound up, she let the device go and watched for a moment to ensure the mechanism still worked. The weight minutely began to fall, the energy provided by gravity twisting the wheel, which turned the cogs, which amplified the effect of the motion and twisted the fan to blow air into her smelter fire. The coals came to life with fire once more. Hot coals on the bottom warming and igniting cold, coals freshly added. The fan would blow for 12 hours, and the smelter chamber would be filled with new blocks by the time she returned, scrap metal melting and flowing into pre-built channels installed into the modular plate that contained them. Cast iron made for poor swords, but it was more than acceptable for clubs and hammers. Bludgeoning was more effective on the steel-skinned monsters anyways. Walking away from the almost auto-smelter, she hefted up her traveling bag once more, then fitted her gauntlets onto her arms and attached their cables to the battery in her bag. Choice bits of salvage from lucky finds in the ruins. The clans on the other side of the mountains didn't come up here, so she had first picked for anything she could carry. The arms were too heavy for delicate work, and wasting battery power, keeping them active, was wasteful. Grabbing her warhammer and emergency mace, she carefully listened for the hum of electricity outside. Hearing nothing, she slowly moved forwards to open the armor plate door and glance around at the mirrors she set up. Nothing around the entrance, safe to move out. She walked out the door and felt the air outside. It was much colder than her forge hideout, but that was a given. It was a warm day, and a slight glare of sunlight was visible through the smog clouds. Reaching into her pack and tearing through a chunk of salted meat, she considered what she needed to check up on. Hideout 1 wouldn't have her meat finished being salted for another week or more, and she had enough stashed away elsewhere. Hideout 3 was still recharging old batteries. Hideout 4 was still drying clay. She supposed it was time to kill another metal beast. It had been a few weeks since the last one. She had recovered, she was well fed, her new armor and weapons were done, and all outposts were running for a few more hours. Not Silverworm, the big bastard, was still too much for her to take on. Not Dagger Digger or Lightning Tail either. She needed proper projectile weapons for them, and she needed black powder for her smoothbores. Energy guns would be preferred, but she had yet to find any in usable state. Plasma eyes might give her a good projectile weapon if she could avoid smashing the plasma shooters. She'd need to be sneaky though. Her armor couldn't take the hit. No, safer to go for something else. A crash in the distance brought her attention. Slowly, perhaps a mile or two away, one of the many towers of stone, metal and glass began to groan and collapse, rumbling as it gave way beneath itself and sending vibrations through the ground. The distinct clicking noise told her its identity. Cutterclaws was a good enough target, she supposed. Unclipping the helmet from her belt and fitting it over her head, she attached the straps to secure it tight against her head and pressed the power button on the side. The words rolled over her vision, just as they had 1,000 times before. StarCorp Cadet, Class Utility, Helm Online. You have been approved for heads. Up display. Anti-dazzle flash compensation. Comlink. Trial. Error, no. Satlink found. Comlink will not function. .g, not function. Cutterclaws was fairly small as far as the metal beasts went. Right about as big as the tracked vehicles that carry the big cannons on top. A large, rounded oval for a main body covered in smooth plates and the occasional spike. Then 2 sets of manipulator arms, a larger pair on top that had blade sets built into the interior, and a smaller set that were blunt and used to grab things. Then revolving sets of 4 legs on each side and below the main body, allowing it to spin entirely around. Cutterclaws liked to find exposed support struts and cut them, sometimes leading to one of the many ruined towers collapsing over from critical supports suddenly no longer being functional. Like all metal beasts, it hated living things and tried to kill them whenever it detected such, which of course meant that the moment she made noise, it locked on and started chasing her. Her iron boots smashed into the concrete as she moved, ducking through a path between 2 buildings and out the other side, hopping over a stone barricade and into the second road. Behind her, Cutterclaws smashed through the relatively thin building, the heavy stone barely putting up resistance against the enraged metal beast, but enough resistance to slow it down. She had to take a rather winding path to her kill zone in order to make sure she wouldn't be caught in the process of luring it there. Metal beasts were almost always faster than her. Warhammer in hand, she kept running, coming up to a broken bridge. Immense and stretching across a massive plaza, down below, she slowed her pace. The metal beast was rapidly gaining on her. She was running out of bridge. She kept moving forwards, waiting for the correct moment. She took her last stomp forwards. The Cutterclaw swiped. She ducked, stomping against the slightly raised section of shattered bridgestone, and twisted. The claw scraped against her helmet, carving a slice off the top. Her warhammer smashed against the track revolver for its legs, immediately yanked from her grip and getting caught in the mechanism. A chunk of thick iron now impaled in relatively delicate machinery. The revolution stopped for a moment. Its right side legs could not compensate for the end of the bridge. It began to slide off, and she was caught in the legs on the other side of the metal beast. Right where she wanted to be. Grabbing onto one of the raised armor plates on the bottom, she let herself be pulled along. The cutter claw turned over as fell off the broken bridge, and now she was perfectly positioned upon its underside, now facing the dark clouds above. She had about 12 seconds to work. She reached down with her other hand, ignoring the futility thrashing legs and claws that tried to swipe at her, and the wind that whipped past her hair. Straining with her power gauntlets, she slowly pried the armor plate up and off, throwing it to the side. She grabbed her emergency mace, flipped to its spike-end handle, and impaled the critical power line that fueled the claws. She was mostly out of time. She threw her mace to the side and braced herself upon the underside. The cutter claw crashed into the relatively cool rock flow below with a titanic boom. Her limbs shook and body was flung about as the impact reached her. She kept her grip tight upon the underside. She'd die otherwise. This section was immensely hot, just barely enough for the stone below to still be semi-mobile. Sweat immediately began to build with the crash, and flecks of molten rock landed on her armor plates, flash welding to them with a hiss of rock on salvaged steel. The cutter claw was doomed now. With power to its claws now disabled, it would die in the molten rock. Now was a matter of escaping with her prize. Quickly moving, avoiding the still thrashing legs, she reached over to grab the now powerless secondary cutter claw, the smaller one. The bigger one weighed several thousand pounds. She couldn't hope to move it and escape the rock flow. The smaller one was much lighter, and more importantly, the perfect size for a new sword. She grabbed a protrusion spike and pulled it up, back towards the underside, as far as it would go. Once there, she rapidly began to use her power gauntlets to undo the many small connectors that attached the claw to the arm. She swallowed. The terrible heat was getting to her. Finally removing enough of the connectors, she grabbed the claw with both arms and twisted, bracing herself against the underside and, snapping off her prize, the long and thin shear claw, only perhaps 100 or so pounds. Hefting it in both arms, she looked around her and considered her path for a moment. She reached up to smack out her backpack, which caught on fire from the ambient heat. Nodding to herself, she jumped. Landing on a cooler section for a moment, she kicked off again as soon as possible. Molten rock, despite being liquid, was more dense than anything she was wearing. She could walk on it so long as she moved quickly, provided she had something heat-resistant. Unlike her thick iron boots, which were already uncomfortably hot, she landed again on an even cooler rock flow and kicked off again. She winced as her feet began to blister from the oven they were in. It was still better than stomping on molten flows, barefoot at least. This process repeated again and again until she finally made it to a section of land that wasn't dangerously hot. Gritting her teeth of the pain in her legs, she stumbled forwards and then into a recess she had mapped out before, relatively sheltered from her surroundings. Topping down with a sigh, she set down her prize and slowly removed her boots to check on the damage. Her power gauntlets were made of a heat-resistant material, so they managed the hot metal just fine. She grunted unhappily at what she saw. All of the first layer and much of the second layer of skin was burned. Fortunately, nothing reached the fatty tissue layer, but the pain would be infuriating for a while. Quickly, she opened her backpack and retrieved the now very warm water container. Unscrewing her best attempt at a filtration lid, she slowly poured the liquid over her burns to cool them off. She grit her teeth as the pain continued to build. Burns were the worst. Water applied, she reached into another pouch and pulled out strips of horn animal leather, quickly wrapping them around her feet and lower legs until they were completely covered. Once done, she put her cooler boots on once more and stood up. Red hot in her legs, white blind in her eyes. She strangled her scream. "Bay-ia!" She refused to stumble. Grabbing her prize claw once more, she loaded up her bag and moved from the protected recess, only to immediately pause at what she saw. There was a figure before her. It was not a metal beast. A giant covered in golden power armor sat on the rock banks a small distance away. left hand covered in immense claws that shone blue, right hand holding her mace held before its gaze for inspection, the one she threw away during her earlier fall. The giant had long black hair and bronze skin. A faint light came from its eyes, and the glare was present even through the flash compensation of her helmet. She focused on the display. Sat link found. Comlink active on channel 1. She turned her focus back towards the giant. It was looking at her now. She tensed. About to run on injured legs, the giant spoke a language. She understood the words. An excellent hunt. Press. She swallowed. No weapons prepared. He'd been watching her. She narrowed her eyes into a sharp glare. What are you? She spoke the words in the language. She did not know how she knew this language. It was one of the many things that she simply knew. A mystery that she had no way of solving. The giant smiled. I am a father looking for his daughter. I have succeeded. W. She considered that for a moment, slowly moving into a position to more easily run if needed. The giant did not react. Probably not a metal beast in disguise then, but too big to be a clansman. Thinking over the words, she eventually came to a conclusion. You claim to be my father. You have no proof I can trust. The giant tilted his head, nodding in consideration. What would it take then for you to see this as truth? Plus. She waved a hand dismissively. Nothing. Everything you could provide could be faked. I've lived here alone, and you are a stranger. There is nothing you can provide to prove that you are truly my father. She grunted in thought for a moment before continuing. It doesn't matter if you are or aren't either way. What matters is if you're worthy of being my father. The giant inclined his head at that. I see, bless. The giant smiled. She found her eyes drawn to the expression. It made her feel successful. What must I do then to prove myself worthy of being your father? Press reaching up, she scratched at her neck for a moment in consideration. What can he do to prove this? The answer was simple. Prove his strength. My father must be at least as strong as my goal. He would have had much more time than I to gain strength and equipment. There is a metal beast that roams the ruins of this land. Massive, long and covered in armor. I call it the silver worm. It is the strongest metal beast I know of. If you could destroy it alone, you will be worthy of being my father. She explained, simply and bluntly. Any clansman would recoil at such a task, for she had seen them flee from the silver worm many dozens of times before. She was not strong enough to defeat it on her own yet. It needed to die and stop ravaging this world with its presence. She had no particular qualms about how it met its end. Unexpectedly, the giant chuckled before rising up from his seated position. I see. Very well then, do you have anything you wish to bring with you? You need to be present to confirm its defeat, no doubt. She considered it for a moment before looking down at the claw in her hands and grunting. She wasn't about to lead a giant back to any of her hideouts. No. We'll go now. She took a step forward. Her eyes widened behind her visor. There was no pain in her legs. The giant was already walking away, beginning to speak once more. Silver worm? I think I shall need my spear for this. Plus, plus. The giant paused before turning his torso around to face her once more. He was smiling widely behind the glare of his light eyes. I consider myself quite the old hand at slaying dragons, you understand? I have a practiced technique putt-putts. She stared for a moment too long before shaking her head with a grunt and glare. I do not know what a dragon is. This is a silver worm. The giant chuckled. All the same, Athena.Piss, she did not pause to consider the name, not yet. He had not proved himself worthy of being her father, so all his names were worthless to her. No further, no further. His daughter called out in blunt old Terran, stopping just before emerging over the ridge ahead. He stopped at once, and the procession of custodians and tech priests following them immediately stopped moving at once. She turned, face only partially visible behind her scavenged helmet, and continued. The silver worm can sense life from a distance halfway to the horizon. It is always hostile to humans. I do not know if it has moved since last I found it. The conditions upon Medusa were particularly poor enough that one of his safeguards had activated within her. In response to being lost in a place completely hostile to life, a basic reservoir of information would flow from their souls and into their minds. In combination with their body growing quicker in response to stressors, This would ensure that his children would be able to survive in nearly any environment without aid. It was unfortunate to see that it had come to pass, but it was good that he had woven such measures into them. Athena was healthy, strong, and stable, about all he could hope for on a world such as this. Fiery-hearted, stony-fleshed, iron-helmed. If any of his daughters were to suffer enough to trigger his safeguards, it was fortunate that it was she designed to best handle such. He had wandered the world after leaving the ruins of Atlantis, and in time he found the familiar pleasures of warfare, women, and wine dull to his senses. He had no equal in battle. He had laid with many of the most beautiful women of all parts of the world, and sampled the finest of wines and ales. In idleness he had sought something new to busy himself with. The sparks from a nearby blacksmith ship drew his gaze. Remembering that his father, from what little he recalled of the man, was also a smith, he decided to master the forge arts as well. From then on, whenever he moved to a new land, he brought his tools with him, and sought the tutelage from the local masters of metalworking. The sparks and joy of mastery brought him a newfound passion for life. He had always practiced the art of war, loving and merrymaking. Adding the practice of the smithing arts to his repertoire was simple enough, although this too eventually dulled to a comfortable familiarity. He kept up the practice, but there was little else to master after a point, and his interest in creation for the sake of creation waned. Athena was drawn from these memories. A clever mind paired with clever hands, a heart of fiery passion paired with a bone-deep sense of duty. The gift given unto her was one of simple pleasures. She would find a satisfaction in fulfilling her duties that would never dull in time as his did. She would take tasks upon herself, and her heart would sing whenever she worked to complete them. Breathing in the ice-cold air for a moment, he looked to the horizon and considered his daughter's words. All around him the blasted and frozen mountains that led up to this more northerly part of Medusa. The smog was thick overhead, and even with a near-constant sun, the lands here were still dark. Halfway to the current horizon would be 1.5 kilometers then, he reasoned aloud. Turning towards the tech priest at the head of the procession, a woman clad in cybernetics that exalted her form and currently aloft upon great walking tendrils that extended from her back, he spoke. Archmagos Dominus, a servo scout if you would. At once, Lord Omnissiah. The woman returned, raising her great cob-shaped axe and summoning forth a servo skull from the procession behind her. The procession was present to harvest any potential relics from the so-called metal beast and the surroundings, and she was leader of such. The whirring servo skull flew bravely forth, rising up and beyond ridge to look beyond. They were amusing little contraptions, basic drones housed in skulls, sometimes vat-grown and sometimes harvested. There was some manner of spiritual significance to that, but he did not bother to learn of it. It was rather harmless, all things considered. Soon enough, the woman spoke out once more. There is an entity that matches the description of your lady daughter, Lord Omnissiah. It is 2.5 kilometers away. Nodding at that, he began to walk up to the edge of the ridge, looking out at the region himself. The so-called Bright Valleys, his daughter named, was only about as illuminated as dusk on Terra. It was a massive mountain valley covered in permafrost and the ruins of an old Federation-era city swallowed by the cold. Much of the buildings on the left side were collapsed and now covered in miles-wide glaciers, the reason for such visible below with active lava flows, visible through great trenches carved into the ice above. The silver worm was immediately apparent to him in the far distance, coiled up like a great snake and armor panels on its body, strangely exposed. It was resting in the exact middle of the brightest region of the now-ruined city glacier, and smooth metallic feelers reaching directly up into the sky. He narrowed his eyes at the metal beast, noting distinct similarities to something. The crunch of snow by his side brought his attention to his daughter, still clutching her metal prize, and now staring at the creature in the distance with a glare and frown. Nodding, she spoke. "That silverworm. If you can kill it, then you're my father." He nodded in turn and waved a hand to indicate it was safe to approach. A handful of his custodians came up, as did the Archmagos. This was a test for him, amusing as that was, so he began to explain his thoughts aloud. "Was it here the last time you observed it?" His daughter spoke in affirmation. "Yes." "Were the panels on its back exposed in that manner?" "Yes." He nodded. "That is one of the brightest spots in the whole of this region. It has not moved. Its armor is exposed. Its feelers are active. From this I have a suspicion that it is attempting to refill its reserves of power with sunlight collectors. Raising a claw and pointing to the head of the creature, he observed a minute detail. Look upon its head, then again at the section somewhat further down. There is a groove in the panels. Elsewhere these grooves are illuminated, but not there. This leads me to suspect that it operates without its primary motive force. How do you know that? His daughter questioned, not disagreeing with him, but testing regardless. I am an old hand at dragon slaying. He answered simply. I have slain a beast such as this before, and those grooves were as bright as a green sun then. This, in addition to its behavior, brings me to my conclusion. The silver worm currently operates on auxiliary power sources. It cannot accumulate power quickly due to the thick smog of this world. The best manner in which to slay it is persistence, to batter it at great distance until it is drained of its scant reserves and can no longer defend itself. He turned his gaze to his daughter, who was quietly observing him. I suspect that you had the same plan. Once you had fully matured, acquired sufficient armor and projectile weaponry, you would engage in a long-term hunt of the creature, slowly whittling its power reserves, chasing at a distance and harassing until it was sufficiently drained enough to slay safely. She nodded. Is that what you will do? He huffed in amusement. Nay, I do not know the limits of its reserve power. Such a hunt could take hours or months, entirely too long. He turned a grin to his daughter. I shall instead simply slay it here and now. A jet bike was one of those technologies pioneered by the nomad clans of Terra. Similar had been available in the days of the Federation, perhaps, but he was ignorant of them. They were in essence a one-man pseudo-aircraft composed of an anti-grave device, an engine, a main thruster, and some auxiliary thrusters. Dangerous, yes, but also dangerously effective when used properly. The nomad clans had been convinced to his banner several hundred years into the unification of Terra, and their learned engineers had been constructing such vehicles for his soldiers to use since. War models also carried forwards, facing weaponry, typically boat or lasguns. As part of the Great Crusade, many gifts had been given unto him by many clans, each seeking his imperial favor. One such gift was from the nomad clans, a cooperatively made jet bike for his personal use and new height. The average man's jet bike was perhaps 3 meters in scale. The larger war bikes given to his custodians, the Gryphorcan models, were perhaps 6 meters in scale. His new personal jet bike, made by their master artisans and clad in golden oromite, was as long as a knight armor was tall, 9 meters in length and humming with power. Running an armored hand across its frame, he smiled as its systems made themselves open to his mind. Its powerful engine, its mighty thrusters, its forward-mounted twin-linked las impulsor ready to fire a barrage of sundering laser fire. Such weapons were normally reserved for tanks. He had named the warbike Gringolet, named for another horse of his distant youth. Malcador sometimes commented that he needed a better naming sense, but he found that simple and effective names were usually the superior choice. Similar reasons were why he still used the same symbol he always had, the twin-headed eagle of gold. Gringolet had been a fine steed, a war horse that he dressed in red and gold livery, particularly gentle with children and rough with sorcerers. He had ridden Gringolet in the service of an ancient king with a fine-looking sword and a persuasive grin. That kingdom was gone now, torn apart by the treachery of the bastard sons of 2 entirely separate sorceresses. 2. He still grumbled to himself about that ridiculous affair at times. He pulled himself from sour memories and made Gringolet roar, engine revving and allowing him to examine its current state. Fully functional, no particular wear, weapons ready, power at full. He nodded to himself, taking stock of the weapons upon his body. Spear in right hand, sword at his belt, boat gun carried in his left hand. His lighter set of orichalcum mail covering his body, servos active and field generator lightly humming. He had left his power claw off this time, remaining in the care of one of his custodians. He would need both hands for this hunt. Rolling his shoulders atop a steed of burnished gold and red livery, he looked to his assembled audience, his daughter, his custodians, the archmagos, the procession of tech priests, and spoke. Beware of stray fire. I know not what weapons the silver worm wields. His custodians saluted. The tech priests bowed in prayer. His daughter stared in silent judgment. He grinned. Gringolet's engine roared, and off the lip of the frozen ridge he rode. The wind rushed past, his hair and cloak whipped behind him, and Gringolet fell in a nearly vertical manner. He focused his will. The great limit on how fast an object might travel was one of air resistance. Without that factor, such as in the void, objects could accelerate indefinitely. So gathering up a portion of his will, he simply cut a path through the air before his steed. Gringolet roared with joy as its path was cleared, and continued to accelerate far past what it might be able to achieve without his will to aid it. His will still interfaced with its systems. He commanded it to activate its additional thrusters. The landscape was devoured under the trample of his warbike, hundreds of meters vanishing in moments as he sped forwards towards the vast bulk of the silver worm. Gringolet's las impulsors began to fire, instantaneous beams of hot light appearing and disappearing with sharp booms of ionized air. The silver worm was barely beginning to uncoil as the first barrage of laser fire impacted its form. Immense bulk not staggering with the force, but sensors twitching in his direction and coiling shifting to face him. The beast was enormous, perhaps a kilometer in total length, and judging from the flashes of green-tinted light that appeared each time his lasers struck its hide, shielded by some manner of field generator, the weapons on the side of its central mouth glowed for a moment. He reacted at once, cutting a path to the side and leveraging his will over Gringolet to turn almost in an instant. Like a massive golden hare, Gringolet changed direction, forcing him to reach out with one armored leg and stomp against the ice to prevent himself from tipping over entirely. The groove of shattered glacier his boot left on the surface was not as wide as the groove left by the twin beams of emerald that the silver worm unleashed, nor as smooth. Some manner of disintegration, weapon similar to the Adrathic weapons of Terra. He grunted, remembering those unstable nightmare things and all the trouble they caused him. A tunnel in the surface of the ice nearly 100 meters long, left by a single devastating moment of the weapons on either side of the silver worm's mouth. Best to not be struck by such a weapon, then. Gringolet straightened out as he continued to sail to the side, the silver worm beginning to track him unerringly. Lifting his boot off the ice, he aimed his bolt gun and fired off a shot. Just as with Gringolet, he carved a path through the air for his rocket-propelled bullet to travel through. Being selective about how he cut through the air allowed him great mobility in how Gringolet moved. The next beams of emerald green were avoided by shaving an upwards path and making Gringolet leap off a ramp of thicker air. The bright green sundered a bold trench into the surface of the glacier. Gringolet descended to its standard height again as he continued to race forwards. In the distance, a moment later, his bolt landed upon the side of the worm's face, a great explosion, visible even from a distance. Yet again, the shield he couldn't observe before the moment of impact flared to life, and pale green prevented any damage to the creature. He would need to discern the mechanism behind its shielding to inflict proper damage, else he would simply be wasting ammunition. His bolt gun only had 11 shots remaining. He grinned. This would be a far simpler matter than the last time. He fired 2 more shots but carved the paths through the air in reverse order. 9 shots remaining. Emerald beams were avoided with another heavy-handed change in direction, air carved and boot smashing into the relatively delicate ice. His path changed, now heading directly for the silver worm again. 2 explosions burst to life, bullets hitting simultaneously against the side of the creature. Pale green shielding force flared to life at the point of impact. In that moment, he commanded Gringolet to unleash a barrage of laser fire. Beams of instantaneous light sliced through the air and crashed against the lower body of the immense creature. The beams of the barrage crashed against unshielded armor for a moment, some seemingly to disappear entirely instead, before it was covered by the pale green once more and protected from further harm. The shield had difficulty when dealing with multiple simultaneous strikes on different sections of the body. An energy-saving function most likely. The last worm had a constant shield about its form. The armor panels at the section he had struck were warped and discolored, slowly beginning to correct itself. An automatic repair function, yet more energy he was forcing it to waste. He forced Gringolet to the side once more, avoiding another barrage of emerald green. At this, the silver worm began to move its colossal bulk, 1,000 legs beginning to revolve and sending it forwards. A great leviathan of metal rearing up and forwards into a dive. It wasn't aiming for him, though, but the ground. He narrowed his eyes as its head crashed into the ice and passed right through without disruption, a green halo heralding its descent into the glacier below. He steered Gringolet to aim at the body as it descended, firing off yet more laser fire and crashing against pale green shielding. He passed over the site of its burrowing just as the tail disappeared into the ice below him. The ice was undisturbed, indicative of some manner of phase shifting to allow it to pass through matter undisturbed. Yet another layer of protection he would have to deal with. 3 in total so far, 2 of which clearly required energy to maintain, and a third, the armor itself, required energy to repair. Considering the weapons it had been firing upon him, his earlier estimate was correct. Its reserves of power must be incredibly vast. They were, however, not unlimited. He raced across the plains of ice and counted the moments. The creature was currently hidden from view beneath the glacier. The most tactically sound option it would take would be to angle itself to aim at him from below and fire its main weapons when under him. He forced a heavy-handed turn yet again, boot carving an immense channel in the ice and sending him racing to the side, straight towards one of the few tower-like structures of the old city still remaining. Cutting the angle of the air before him, Gringolet ascended up the side of the immense pillar and well away from the glacier ground below. This gave him a better angle to view the ice, something required, as the glacier tinted soft green. He cut a new angle, forcing Gringolet off the tower in an instant, just in time for the twin rays of disintegration to slice the icy pillar in twain. Gringolet's engine roared as he raced through the air now, pushing off the sides and tops of towers and steering through, carving his intended path through the winds. He simply had to wait for it to emerge again, nothing much else to be done for the moment. Every moment it decided to remain under the ice and fire at him was yet more energy he was forcing it to waste. Each time the glacier glowed pale green, he forced a new angle in the air and turned in ways jet bikes simply were not capable of on their own, often smashing himself into walls of recurrent air resistance. He was certain his flesh was getting bruised. Beams of annihilation bored a dozen holes in the glacier ice and cut their way through the tops of a dozen more towers of ice and Federation stone. It was good. Medusa was so dark, the glow was far easier to spot in this dimness. He grinned as the silver worm slowly emerged from the glacier, perhaps 2 kilometers away from his current position. It was enormous, so it was quite easy to spot from his current place in the sky. Changing his angle of flight once more, he descended down the side of an icy pillar in approach. Straightening out in a hard break against the floor of the glacier and racing forwards, he kept a consistent barrage of laser fire booming out. The silver worm changed its tactics, directly approaching now and occasionally sending forth beams of emerald light. Now that he was head-on, it was rather easy to avoid through specific tunneling in the air and commands issued to Gringolet. Weaving through lances of destruction on approach, the head was consistently shielded by pale green. Only on rare occasions did his laser shots breach the field, most of which passed directly through the beast and crashed into icy mountains in the distance, and some of which crashed into plates of silvery armor. Said plates of silvery armor warping and distorting, but then slowly putting themselves into order afterwards. 3 entirely separate layers of protection acting in unison to render the massive las impulsors normally used to destroy tanks and buildings almost ineffective against it. A formidable defense. He was quite impressed by it. Gringolet roars forwards hundreds of meters past in moments. The silver worm met his challenge with a charge of its own, 1,000 limbs digging into the ice and hauling its immensity forwards. He adjusted his position on Gringolet and his grip on his spear. The twin weapons on the silver worm's head glowed. He jumped. Mind still connected to Gringolet, he commanded it to turn away. Twin beams passed through the air where he and Gringolet would have been. He soared forwards and up, raising his bolt gun to fire thrice upon distant sections of the beast's body, carving a path for the bullets to travel through. 6 bullets left. It raised its head to follow him. He hurled his spear at its underbelly, yet another path carved through the air. The force of his throw halted his momentum in part. The silver worm's weapons glowed green. He grinned. His hand caught Gringolet's side as it passed through the air in front of the silver worm, carrying him out of the path of the twin beams with great strain on his arm. It had been simple to command it to circle around to pick him up again. His bullets crashed into the far section of its body in fiery blossoms. Pale green formed to protect it. At the same moment, his spear crashed into its midsection. The spear was one of two he had wrought during the Unification Wars. The other had been given to Valdor. He had given this spear a name for a particular spear he had known in his youth, one wielded by a rather obnoxious sorcerer king he had been acquainted with, Gungnir. A tremendous boom heralded a newborn sun bursting to life against the underbelly of the silver worm. Unlike all other attacks he had landed thus far, this one forced it to stagger back. Righting himself upon the saddle of Gringolet once more, he raised his hand and focused upon the specific Psytech beacon in the distance. Once located, he carved a path. A few moments later, his spear raced back to his hand, called by his will and a lack of air resistance. He forced Gringolet to twist into another sharp turn, avoiding yet another set of annihilation beams, and firing upon the silver worm as the mist of melted ice surrounding it began to clear. A significant chunk of its midsection was simply gone now, although the silver frame was bubbling and attempting to repair itself with each passing moment. If he waited long enough, it would be entirely corrected. He had little intention of waiting. The shielding had trouble with simultaneous blows, the phasing was on a specific interval, the armor was not insurmountable, the self-repair was slow. The riddles of its defenses were known to him now. Its defeat was inevitable. It's a shame it wasn't making any noise. The roars from such a beast would be wonderful to hear. Still, if he wanted to defeat it quickly, he would need to inflict yet another simultaneous blow. No, 2 more simultaneous blows, 4 in total, just to be safe. He focused on avoiding more emerald beams for a time, pondering on how best to approach such a task. Eventually, a plan crystallized in his mind, and he nodded to himself. Forcing another near-impossible turn with Gringolet, he swerved to avoid yet another set of emerald lights and began to race forwards and then down the side of an immense canyon in the ice. He'd need height for this. Down into the icy gorge he went, the silver worm above, shifting to follow with manifold legs and heat increasing with each passing moment. Forcing another turn correction, feet trailing against the molten stone at the bottom, he began to ascend the side of the canyon and straight up. The 1,000 eyes of the silver worm glared down at him as he raced upwards, swerving around emerald lances as they attempted to annihilate him. Readying his spear for a throw, the worm reacted, immediately moving back and away. This was, of course, a diversion. Gringolet roared as it carried him high into the air, screaming as it and his will cut a path through the air. Adjusting his legs, he leapt upwards and commanded Gringolet to turn away. He floated up for a few more moments, feeling the wind race against his hair before slowing his descent with another exertion of his psychic power. Turning his head down, he locked gazes with the immense silver worm. It glared hatefully at his relatively tiny form. He grinned in gigantic mirth and raised his bolt pistol. 6 shots against the bulk of the creature. It would take them some time to land. Now exhausted of ammunition, he set his handgun against his thigh and let the magnets hold it in place. His spear was still adjusted for throwing. He readied himself for the precise moment and allowed himself to fall quickly again. It aimed its head at him more squarely. Gringolet completed its wide turn, and weapons glowed in preparation. His bullets approached its body. The weapons on the side of its head began to glow green. He reached his mind out, far into the sky above him, and searched for a particular connection. Twin beams of emerald annihilation carved a path through the atmosphere above the kilometer-long silver worm. Archaeotech lightning took hold of his form, and in a boom of thunder he was many meters to the right. Disintegration rays passed through where he used to be. He threw his spear straight down as a bolt of golden lightning. That was 3 blows. The worm began to shift, doing its best to avoid the hurled weapon. His grin escalated into laughter. His connection with the Imperial teleportation array was still active. He reached down for his last weapon. In another flash of Archaeotech lightning, he vanished. His golden boots crashed into the spiny back of the silvery worm. It immediately began a massive convulsion in an attempt to twist away. His bullets crashed against its midsection hundreds of meters away. Pale green protected it. His hands grabbed hold of his sword's hilt. Gringolet's laser fire crashed into its underbelly. Pale green flickered against the new threat. His hands drew his blade. Gungnir crashed down against its head. Pale green flickered and died against a newborn star. His hands swung his blade. His grin escalated into booming laughter. He poured the sum total of his will into his blade. Its systems caused it to ignite in blinding white flame. It crashed against the weakened section in its center, where his spear had hit earlier. The Lands of Shadow, a fearsome and frigid place where metal-fleshed monsters roamed and ghosts wailed, bore witness to a tsunami of golden-white flame. The death throes of the greatest monster upon the world, called Medusa. And with this city-wide wave of psychic flame came the booming laughter of an ancient warrior, carried up and across the mountains by gigantic lungs, heard and witnessed by an awestruck delegation of machine ministers, golden-clad demigods, and a young woman with light brown eyes. For he was quite the old hand at dragon-slaying,